Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter, and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. I'm excited to have you here because today I'm collaborating with several of my favorite crafty YouTubers to bring you the Summer 2022 Card Crafters Collaborative. These ladies and I will be joining together around the central theme of summer fun. There's lots of inspiration that will be shared, so I hope you check out the details below and visit each one of our videos for inspiration. Let's go ahead and get started with my card. So as I often like to do, I like to plan out my cards. So I've used my card planner, which you can find in my Etsy shop, and I'll have it linked below, to plan out the card that I'm going to be making today. Not only does using the card planner help me figure out what products I need to pull, it also helps me to figure out the steps that I need to go about in making the card. To make this card, I'm going to be using several products today, starting with the Flippin' Fabulous Stamp and Die Set from Honeybee Stamps. I'll also be using a couple of different colors of distress ink, including tumbled glass, salvage patina, and saltwater taffy. There'll also be another color or two that'll show up later on. I raided my embossing powder stash and decided to use 3 different ones today, including Sparkling Sea, Sand, which is this one, and a white puff embossing powder. All 3 of these powders are from Hero Arts. And of course, in order to use embossing powder, you have to have a Versamark or a watermark ink. And I'm also going to be using VersaFine Onyx Black ink as well. To create my card panel, I'm going to be using several pieces of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock in an 80-pound weight. I'm going to be using that cardstock for both the panel as well as any of the elements that I die cut. I recently purchased these shader blending brushes from Waffle Flower. These are the size 0, and I'm going to be using those on some of the elements today. But to start us off, I'm going to be doing a little bit of ink blending because I want this ink to have a chance to dry back before I do any of the next steps with it. So I'm going to come in first on one of the panels and ink blend some tumbled glass onto a panel. I don't need to cover the whole panel because this is going to be a base layer for our water element on the card. I'm going to apply the Sparkling Sea embossing powder on top of this, so I just wanted a nice layer of color underneath to fill in any gaps. Next, I'm going to blend some saltwater taffy and salvage patina together to be the base of our flip-flops. And because I just need enough to cover the flip-flop image, I'm just going to use probably the top left third, or left fourth rather, of this piece of cardstock. So I'm laying down my saltwater taffy first, and I want a good coverage of that. And then I'm going to finish that up, or follow that up rather, with some salvage patina. I do want to kind of blend the 2 colors together in the middle to transition from one color to the next. So this color, again, I want to put it down first and give it a little bit of time to dry back before I stamp the flip-flops on them. All right, and that finishes the ink blending for the flip-flop panel. So now that my tumbled glass inked up panel has had a little bit of time to dry, it's time to move on to creating our sand and our water. For the sand part of the card, I want almost a full panel with full coverage of this sand embossing powder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my Versamark ink pad, and you can use whatever embossing ink you may have, and I'm going to rub this ink pad across my panel. You need to make sure that you're looking at the panel to make sure that you have great coverage because you don't want any blank spots. Now I'm going to bring in a coffee filter to catch my leftover embossing powder, and using the sand embossing powder, I'm going to give a complete coverage to about 2/3 of this card panel. That's about how much I inked up with my Versamark ink. And so I'm going to sprinkle it all over the panel and get a complete coverage of this panel. So there, as the embossing powder slides off, you can see that that panel is completely covered. I really, really love this sand embossing powder. If you've never tried it before or seen it before, it really, really does look like sand. So I'm going to pour my excess back into my container. Coffee filters work great for this. They're inexpensive and you can get a ton of them on hand at one time. So we're going to move on to the panel that's going to be the water. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, except this time, because there is inking on this panel, I don't want to drag the ink pad across. I could possibly get that blue ink into my embossing ink, and I really don't want that. So instead of dragging the ink pad across the panel, I'm going to pounce it all over the inked up area and make sure that I get good ink coverage, embossing ink coverage on top of the blue inked up area. So now I'm going to come in with that Sparkling Sea embossing powder. I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the sand and get really good coverage of my inked up area. The Sparkling Sea embossing powder has clear, it has a couple of different shades of blue, it also has some glittery specks in it. Additionally, some of the flakes inside this embossing powder are kind of large. So you're going to see that in just a minute when we get ready to heat set this particular panel. So I'm going to pour the excess back into my container just like I did with the sand, because I definitely want to have this to use in the future. I've allowed my heat gun to get nice and hot, and so I'm going to set this embossing powder on both the back side and the front side. So I'm going to start on the back side and heat up the back side, and it's going to, cause the paper to curl just a tiny bit. But that will be corrected when I move the heat gun to the front. We've moved to the front, and now we're going to melt this embossing powder all the way across this panel. In this sand embossing powder, there are different metallic flecks that really add to the realistic look of sand. This is one of my favorite embossing powders of all time. Quickly joining the ranks of being high on my list of embossing powders is this Sparkling Sea embossing powder. So just like I did with the sand, I'm going to heat it up from the back and allow it to melt a little bit from the back. And then we're going to switch over to the front and completely melt all of the embossing powder that is on the front of the panel. So you can kind of see there the glittery, sparkly look that this panel is taking on because of this embossing powder. These two embossing powders working together are really going to set the scene for this card. So you can see on my hand there's large chunks of embossing powder that are all over my hand. So I'm going to rub those off and clean those up in just a second. One of my favorite tools that I have in my craft room isn't even for crafting, but rather it's for cleaning up. And it's my little mini desktop vacuum. This little mini vacuum is perfect for cleaning up things like embossing powder and other little bitty die cuts that seem to find their way all across my workspace. I'll be sure to have this mini vac linked on my blog post for this video. So for the transition between my sand and water, I want some of that sea foam that is created when the waves come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear organically the edge of my sand paper that I heat embossed with that sand embossing powder. And you see that white part there? I'm going to bring in a Versa marker, and I'm going to cover that white part with some Versa marker ink, which is just Versamark ink in a pen form. And then I'm going to use that third embossing powder, the white puff. So here I am going to color over the white part that I tore off. And I tore the paper where it would tear and leave the white part. So that means I needed to tear towards me instead of away from me, because I definitely wanted that white part because I needed it to help me create my foam. So I've got my Versamarker. I'm covering all of the white space with the Versamarker. And now I'm going to come in with that white puff embossing powder. Again, all three of these embossing powders are from Hero Arts. I'll be sure to link all of the products that I'm using today on my blog post that will coordinate with this video. The white puff embossing powder is only going to stick to where I use that Versamarker, which I really, really love. So I'm bringing in my coffee filter, bringing that back in to catch the excess. And now I'm going to hit this with, need to cover up a little bit more space there, and I'm going to hit it with my heat tool. And this embossing powder is just going to create a little bit of texture in the area where I'm using it to make it look like it's foam, or it's raised off the paper. So I'm going to throw my little scrap piece of paper I was using away. I'm done with that. Now I'm going to bring my heat tool in. Again, it's hot. I've let it warm up. And when this embossing powder heats up, you can kind of see it transitioning a little bit there. It just bubbles up and gives great dimension and texture to whatever you use it on. So I'm going to pull in the panel just a little bit closer so you can actually see what's happening as I heat up this embossing powder. This really just adds the foamy texture I was looking for to this card. Now it's time to move on to making all of the elements that we want to include in this card. So I'm going to have a pair of flip-flops and some seashells that I'm going to be stamping and die cutting. So you can see there's the flip-flops. They're rather large. So what I'm trying to create is kind of a perspective kind of look. So the flip-flops will be in the forefront, and the water and some of the sand will be in the background. So I'm going to put my sandals down, my flip-flops down, and then I'm going to add a couple of the seashells. I wanted to make sure that my flip-flops were positioned on the inked up part so I can see both colors represented, because I'm going to do something special with these flip-flops when it comes time to add them to the card. So now that I've got all my stamps positioned, I'm going to come in with this VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I love this ink. It's always so crisp and clean, and I have it just makes a great stamped impression. So I'm going to ink all of the images up with this VersaFine ink and stamp it down and get ready to die cut these images out. I'm going to use my towel to just kind of press along the images to make sure that I get a good impression. And see, this VersaFine ink just never fails me. It gave me a good impression with just one stamp. So now I'm going to take this over to my die cutting machine, and off camera I went ahead and die cut all of the images out. And I just absolutely adore these flip-flops. I think they turned out so cute. I went ahead and inked up a couple of the images off camera, and now I'm going to ink up the rest of them. We're going to do the starfish, and I just have a little bit of brown ink that remains on my starfish. I believe this is Vintage Photo that is on there. So I'm just going to ink up the edges a little bit to give our starfish a little bit of color. Now I'm going to come in with my waffle flower detailed brushes, and I'm going to add a little bit of detailing in the spiral of one of this seashell. This is where having these small brushes like this are absolutely fantastic. I think I'm going to do a video about the different types of brushes that I have. I think I have about 5 or 6 different kinds of brushes. So look for a future video where I'll kind of go through the brushes I have and kind of talk about some of the pros and cons of the different brushes. But I'm really liking these tiny brushes and the detail I'm able to add to images, especially an image as small as this one. You need a small brush to get into these little tight nooks and crannies. So here's a closer look at the detail I was able to add to that seashell. To add a little more interest to this card, I wanted to make it look like my flip-flops were sticking up out of the sand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of position my flip-flops where I think I want them to be. And then I'm going to take an X-Acto knife or any sharp knife that you may have, and I'm going to cut some slits into the sand embossed piece of cardstock where I want my flip-flops to kind of tuck into the sand. So it takes me a couple of cuts to figure out how large the slit needs to be for the flip-flop to slide down in there. And here's my first cut, and I see it's a little bit too small, so I went in and extended the cut, and now my flip-flop is stuck down into the sand. And this really just kind of is where I really started to see the card and my vision that I had drawn out on my planner, my card planner, where I started to see it all come together. So now I'm kind of figuring out where I want the second slit for the second flip-flop to be. And now I've done that, and I can slide both flip-flops into my card. Or into the sand, should I say. It's little touches like this that will take your card over the top and just make it that much more special. So now that I've figured out where I want them to be, I'm going to go ahead and glue them down, and by placing some glue on the back of the flip-flops and glue them to the heat embossed panel. Keep in mind we have both the sand embossing powder and that white puff embossing powder, so we're going to need to make sure that these are secured down well since there's so much texture going on this part of the panel. So this Scotch quick drying tacky glue is great for that. So I'm ready to adhere the sand panel to the water panel. So I'm going to bring in my tape gun and apply some permanent adhesive tape to the back of the panel. That's going to run across all the parts and pieces, the flip-flops and the sand panel, and allow me to adhere all of that to the water panel. When I was adhering the sand down, I didn't think that enough of the water would be showing. So I'm going to move the sand down a little bit, which just means that I'm going to need to trim off some of that sand, the sand panel at the bottom. I'll take it off screen to my paper trimmer and be able to make a nice even cut so that my panel is even at the bottom and ready to be adhered to my card base. Everything's exactly where I want it, so I'm pressing it in place. Off camera, I've gone ahead and trimmed it down, and now I'm going to play around with the placement of the seashells to kind of see how I want those to be adhered to the card. I decide to go ahead and use some foam dots to lift up some of the seashells. So I'm going to put some dots behind several of the seashells and kind of lift those up off of the sand in order to give some dimension. So now that all of the elements are adhered to the panel, now it's time to secure the panel to our card base. The card base is made using accent opaque cardstock in 120-pound weight. This is a heavyweight cardstock that is strong enough to stand up to all the weight that the elements in this card are going to add to it. It's my favorite cardstock to use for card bases, and I try to always have it on hand. I'll be sure to link it on my blog post that coordinates with this video, where I will also link all the products that I'm using today. So now we're going to adhere the decorated panel to our card base. And then you can tell that I did go ahead and trim the card panel, down so that I can have a white border around the edge of my card. I love how having the white border creates a frame for the card and really highlights all the things we decorated the card panel with. So I'm just going to place an acrylic block on top of that panel to provide a little bit of weight. Off camera, I went ahead and stamped and die cut the sentiment, which is "Take me to the beach." I took a couple of pieces of scrapped cardstock, cut some additional sentiments from them, and layered those up so that my sentiment would have some support as well as dimension. So after giving that sentiment just a little bit of time to dry, it's now time to adhere the sentiment to our card panel. Again, because there is so much dimension on this card panel, I want to make sure I use a strong adhesive to glue my sentiment down. This Scotch Quick Dry tacky glue is perfect for this. I noticed that my foam was not adhered down as well as I wanted it to be, so I'm just going to add just a touch of glue behind that and press that down to make sure that it's nice and secured. And with that, this card is complete. I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel, and also thank you for joining us in the Card Crafters Collaborative. Links to all of the participants' videos can be found in the description box, as well as links to my social media and website. Thanks everyone. Enjoy!